None of these thousands of people that are cheering him on just a few days before are going to be present to cheer him on or support him when he's on that cross. So we know that their thought of who he was very different than what he ends up being to them. Okay, so that's why they like him. Remember that the Jews sort of wanted to kind of purge the foreigners. They wanted the Romans off their land. They wanted the Gentiles out of this court and away from their temple, away from their city. And they expected Jesus to make things right, primarily by getting rid of the foreigners in our lives. Okay, Josh and I were talking after class. Josh, in 2016, you made a point I thought was pretty good when we were talking about the parable of the vineyard. What really offended them?
The fact they were opening it up to someone else. Or Jesus was opening it up to someone else. Was it?
In that parable, one of the things that would really trigger them was that vineyard owner is going to come in. And it's not just that you don't get to be there. We're giving it to other people. We're giving it to what you consider half-breeds. We're giving it to what you consider outcasts, non-chosen people, dirty, unclean people. That's who we're going to give it to. Okay, let's go even bigger picture. Okay, so let's start in the wilderness. We get a tabernacle. They do their sacrifices. They would take that tabernacle with them. That's how God's presence traveled with them. Then eventually, when they've landed, we've got a temple. Remember this? Okay, so in that previous picture, this is that big area. This little border here is that giant area where all those people were and the animals and everything else. In the middle was the Holy of Holies, right here. It had a very thick veil as a door. Why did it have a thick veil?
Likely to keep people out, to keep it from being seen, because all of the Levites had different responsibilities. And
Yep.
he's the high priest, then he's the only one who's allowed.
That's right. It had a thick veil, and I put in my notes, because God's presence will kill humans. Right? Remember when they opened the ark, whenever it returned from Beth Shemesh? They just wanted to check and see if the contents of the ark, Aaron's rod that budded, and the 10 Commandments were in there, and it says that 70,000 people died that day. Because that ark represented God's presence among the people. It wasn't that God is this cruel God. It was just we opened it and just power went out and they were killed. And so we got this thick veil. That veil serves as the doorway. And once a year on Yom Kippur, what is Yom Kippur? Day of Atonement. The high priest would go inside and make a blood sacrifice. When Jesus is hanging on the cross, just before he dies, the sun stops shining. And the veil of the temple is torn in two from top to bottom. Symbolizing what?
The presence of God is with the people now, not isolated to the temple.
That's right. Now, because of Jesus, we can open that ark. We can walk in to the Holy of Holies because of Jesus. In fact, in Hebrews 10:20, it specifically says, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. Jesus is the doorway that allows us to walk into the Holy of Holies and be directly in the presence of God without dying. So let's back up. These people following were excited about him getting the foreigners out, the Gentiles and the Romans. But what is Jesus going to give them? No one?
A new way to worship.
Right, but they want Gentiles and Romans out. We don't want you here anymore. We want the Messiah to come. We want to clean up this mess. I want the Romans out of our territory. I want to live in Israel, God's chosen city, with God's chosen people. And I don't want any of these filthy people here with me. Right? That's what they want. Is that what Jesus gives them? What does he give them?
Jews and Gentiles reconciled together in one body.
He gave them exactly the opposite of what they were looking for. They thought Messiah coming meant, I want these Gentiles out of this court. I want to clean these things up. But what Jesus gave them is, no. That's not what my kingdom's about. We're actually going to bring everybody in. Anyone. In fact, you won't even need to go to the Holy of Holies anymore with the priest every year. Because you will be able to access God's presence at any time. You know what the temple will be in my new kingdom? It will be your bodies. And you will offer living sacrifices in that temple daily to your God. It's a very different kingdom than what they were looking for. Okay, back to the reading. So early in Jesus' life, I think around 6 AD, Rome starts to directly rule over Judea and Samaria. And a census is conducted. Why is a census conducted?
So that'd be taxed.
That's right. Richard knows. So they can tax their citizens. This particular tax was kind of a symbol of political subjectum. Right? They did the census to account for the people, but they wanted to account for the people so that they could let those people know, you're subject to Caesar, and you're going to have to pay tax to Caesar if you don't want to get in trouble. And so it was violently opposed by many in Israel on sort of patriotic grounds. Right? In fact, I read about Judas of Galilee, not a Judas that we know of from our readings, I don't think. He had a rebellion that gets crushed, refusing to pay to Caesar. And he gets completely destroyed, and so do all of his people. But the ideology had a phrase, no king but God, was their kind of phrase. And that lived on. A lot of the Jews in that time would kind of support this. I have no king but God. I'm not paying to Caesar. Because Caesar's coins, what did those coins say on them? What did Caesar claim that he was? We talked about this in one of my first classes.
Didn't he claim to be a deity?
That's right. He claimed to be a god. He claimed to be the Savior. He claimed to be the Savior for these people. So you can just imagine that the Jews who were looking for the Savior really saw this as an affront to their life when the coins say, like when we see a coin that says, "In God we trust," and it says, I think it said some things about Caesar, I don't remember what, but basically that Caesar is a god, and that Caesar is the one that saves them. And so this no king but God movement that Judas started kind of led to the Zealot movement. Who knows what the Zealot movement was? In short.
Rebellion.
I didn't hear you.
The sect of Jews that wanted to overthrow the rule
And how do they do it?
with violence.
Yeah, so, I always think it's very interesting that Jesus takes on Simon the Zealot as one of his disciples. Because for sure, Simon the Zealot would have had like a shank in his coat, waiting for a guard or someone to come along so that he could end him. And they're what? You ever seen the prison movies? It's like a bunch of quick stabs, you move quickly. So they had the shanks on them. That's why I said the shanks. And the thing is the Zealot movement was actually a little bit like, it was a little bit like Abraham trying to figure out how he's going to have this son and kind of jumping the gun. And saying like, well, maybe I'll go about this way to have the son. Because these people were just saying like, well, God hasn't done what I want him to do. So let's just, maybe the way that we show our faith is we just do it. Maybe we just go and just make it happen. And so the Zealot movement, the reason I wanted to bring that up is because historians, not necessarily, I have other ideas of why this happened, but a lot of historians think that the Zealot movement led to Rome coming in to destroy Jerusalem. So I just kind of want to make sure everyone understands that like there's a contingent of people that think that this sort of anti-Rome idea that was kind of perpetuating among the Jews led to a lot of violence from Romans towards Jews. Because they were trying to say, we're not subject kind of to you. Okay. You're probably wondering if we're ever going to get to the actual text. So, the tax question. Let's start with this first. What were the possible repercussions of Jesus saying, yes, you should pay the tax to Caesar?
Anger from the Jews.
Okay. Anger from the Jews, they'd see him as a traitor, maybe? So if he says yes, we keep running into these questions where if you say one answer, you're killed, and you say one answer, you're killed. Like, there's no right answer. It's like you got to come up with another question. That's the only way to get out of the situation. And so if he says yes, he might be viewed as a traitor. What if he says no?
An insurrectionist.
Now they can just turn him in to like a Roman guard and be like, hey, this person's out there saying that you don't have to pay this tax. Okay. Let me ask you this. What's the significance of him asking for them to produce the actual coin? Remember in the text, it says, in verse 22, is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not? But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, show me a denarius.
Here's the evidence.
What's curious about him asking them to show a coin?
You know you've got one on you.
I mean, isn't he sort of indicting them right here? There's these huge crowds around. I said last week, I said on Sunday that he's quick on his feet. Like, this right here is like crazy quick on your feet. He says, oh, does someone have a coin? Who can show me a denarius?
Don't be interrupted. This is kind of show and tell. I'm going to pass it around.
Oh, sweet.
This is a denarius from AD 30. I like to think it's the one that Jesus actually went. When you pass it around, look in the back of it. You'll see Caesar's inscription on the one side. The other side has three symbols, and those are the three symbols that symbolize the three hierarchies of the religious hierarchies of the Roman Empire. Meaning, and it says augur on it, it means that he's the epitome of the priesthood and the savior of all.
Yeah.
Just like
That's great, John. Thanks for
So I'll
showing
pass
us
it
out.
around. Show and tell. If you don't see it, just come to me and I'll show it to you.
Yeah, so I think the question of, hey, does anyone have a coin? Let's see it. I mean, he knew what the coin had on it, but this is it's just an uncomfortable position for those that are there to produce the coin. And it's like, well, yeah, I do have one. I don't support. I mean, it's just, it puts you in that spot of where do you land on this question? Okay, so then, again, very cleverly, he says, well, whose picture's on it? Well, Caesar's is on it. Okay. We'll give Caesar's the things that are Caesar's. And then he says, but give God the things that are God's. And I think it's very interesting in the context of this, because Caesar's picture's on the coins, obviously. But we are created in God's image. Literally. So when he says, give to God what is God's, he is saying, you owe all to God. You can give to Caesar his coins, I don't care. But you owe your very existence and breath at this moment to God.
Who of them didn't have a denarius in their pocket? That was the currency of the day.
Right. Okay, so anyway, I just think it's a powerful response, and all we have, we owe to God. We can never really repay him for the things he's done for us. How do we process through God versus Caesar today? Do we deal with this issue?
Yes.
Any examples?
This year. This whole year.
This whole year?
Yeah.
This is a real problem for us? You know, I think Jesus makes an interesting point, because he had people among him, like Simon the Zealot, who thought, we're going to have to take matters into our own hands, and the way to be a good follower of God is going to be to kill the people that don't do things the way that we want them to do. And I think Jesus makes a very clear-cut distinction here. You can give those coins to Caesar. Now, is he saying, you do whatever Caesar tells you no matter what? Not even Jesus did that, right? When they asked him questions, they would not, he would not be compromised when it came to his life, his loyalty, and where he was actually going to be. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German theologian and a pastor. And, he really grew in his understanding for the need of civil disobedience in certain instances. When Dietrich was 27 years old, he wrote an essay entitled, "The Church and the Jewish Question," after the Nazi regime had boycotted Jewish businesses. We recently went and watched the movie Bonhoeffer. It might actually be in theaters now. I'd highly recommend it. It's done by Angel Studios. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a very impressive man. I kind of left the movie kind of feeling like, man, I'm not doing enough. It's one of those, like, you watch someone else and what they're doing and you're thinking, man, I'm so lame. Look at this guy. Like, he's so impressive. When the Nazis were taking over Germany, he was one of the few pastors at the time that was willing to stand up in those churches with Nazi militants in the crowd and say, I'm against you, and you should not, be doing the things that you're doing. Yes?
He's one of the heroes. He helped with the Underground Church and the Confessing Church and so many other things. And he ended up in Harlem for a while, and he was just so dismayed at what he saw about racism here. And so...
They cover some of that in the movie. It's really powerful. And the thing is, one of the things that's really interesting about him is that he picks up on, when he goes back to Germany, that the Nazi party has become much more violent than he realized. He didn't have Facebook or whatever, Twitter, to keep up with the news. So when he goes back and he's hanging out with his family and his dad is listening on the radio to hear what the latest news is of what's going on with this Nazi regime, a light bulb goes on and he realizes, oh, things have gotten really bad here. This has turned really, really awful. And then he goes into Germany knowing 100% he wasn't coming out. Because he was so bold against them. He stood up to the Nazis. He even attempted to assassinate Hitler. In 1945, just 2 weeks before Hitler killed himself, he was hung for his part in the plot to assassinate Hitler. And so I think the point that I'm trying to make with this is, I think there's a line where we can render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and there's a line where we cannot. And that line is probably not always super clear, but when you see things like at least what we saw in World War II, it's pretty clear cut. That kind of stuff Christians can't stand for. It's too much. It's too much death. It's too much evil. They've got to take a stand, even if it means going against the government.
But I would also say that civil disobedience had to be reckoned here.
Say that again?
I'd have to say that civil disobedience had to be reckoned here in the United States with the civil rights movement and things that couldn't be tolerated.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we'd be in a very different society.
For sure.
And I wouldn't be sitting here likely.
I had a long Martin Luther King thing that I was going to read, and I've got way too much to cover, but I'm totally with you, and would love to cover that sometime. Okay, let's keep moving. So I've got 10 minutes, and we're just going to move a little bit faster. Luke 20:27. Okay. There came to him some Sadducees, those who deny that there is a resurrection, and they asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, having a wife but no children, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first took a wife and died without children. And the second and the third took her, and likewise all 7 left no children and died. Afterward, the woman also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had her as a wife. And Jesus said to them, The sons of this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy to attain to that age and to the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. For they cannot die anymore, because they are equal to angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. But that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Now he is not God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him. Then some of the scribes answered, Teacher, you have spoken well. For they no longer dared to ask him any question. All right. How about this? Did you envision being single in the afterlife? What are we talking about here?
Totally different world.
Why are they bringing this up? Well, first, who's bringing it up? What do you say?
His enemies.
His enemies, but what specific group of them? Sadducees. Okay. So, and what about the Sadducees? What do we know about the Sadducees?
They don't believe in the resurrection.
Okay. They don't believe in the resurrection. So they come and ask him. This very convoluted example of this woman and the 7 brothers. What are they trying to get at? What are they trying to do?
Make them take a side, like they often do.
Yeah. They don't believe in the resurrection. They think they've got a troubling problem to coerce them into an answer that will allow them to accomplish their purposes or whatever. And we don't have tons of time to spend on it, so here's what I will say about it. What can we take away from this section with Jesus and what he says about it?
You're talking about people who are theorizing about the afterlife and one who has actually experienced that realm. And they're asking him questions, trying to trap him. And that's just the height of irony.
And that kind of goes along. So my thought is that one thing Jesus does, his primary point seems to be there is a resurrection. There is an afterlife.
There is a spirit world.
Right.
They denied that.
So they thought no resurrection, and Jesus, in his answers for them. No, there's a resurrection. There's an afterlife. A.W. Tozer said, "Let no one apologize for the powerful emphasis Christianity lays upon the doctrine of the world to come. Right there lies its immense superiority to everything else written within the whole sphere of human thought or experience. We do well to think of the long tomorrow." The afterlife is a very important part of being a Christian. Paul said, if the resurrection is not real, we are to be the most pitied. So this question that the Sadducees ask, we hinge everything, our entire lives, on our belief that this is not it. That when we die, or when God takes us, that we will live on to something that is hard for us to understand, but that lasts forever. Okay. 5 minutes. Starting in 41. But he said to them, how can they say that the Christ is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. David thus calls him Lord. So how is he his son? And in the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. Okay, so this point about David. How can they say that Christ is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. David thus calls him Lord. So how is he his son? What's he trying to tell him?
He's eternal, and so he was around before and physically David's son.
Yeah, he was there. But I think there's a string that goes from like chapter 1 or 2 all the way to here. Remember what I've mentioned several times about Mary? You're going to have a son. And whose throne is he going to sit on? David's throne. But what are we learning now about Jesus sitting on David's throne?
He's not only king, he's Lord.
Do you think of the concept that Jesus was on David's throne before David was on his throne?
Well, I was thinking more from the perspective of
Doesn't look like David sitting on his throne.
Yeah, right.
David called the Messiah Lord. I think it's similar to like in Hebrews where it starts to talk about Abraham tithing to Melchizedek. And what's the point that's being made there? It's talking about the lineage that Jesus comes from. You know, we can't have a high priest unless they come from the tribe of Levi. But what tribe did Jesus come from? Well, he's not from that order. He's from a different order. He's from the order of Melchizedek. Someone who had no beginning and no end. Someone who was both priest and king. Someone who Abraham gave 10% of everything to after the battles. And so when we see here, and he says, basically, he says, if David himself calls Messiah Lord, then the Messiah must be greater than David. I think he's establishing the authority of which Jesus is in this kingdom. We start in chapter 1 or 2 with the reference to David being the son of Mary, or that Jesus is going to sit on the, not the son of Mary, that David is, that Jesus is going to sit on David's throne, and that kingdom is going to last for forever. But when we get here to chapter 20, what we learn is that, no, not only is he going to sit on David's throne, but this king is above David. David calls this king Lord. It's an authority topic. And then he goes on this topic of authority, he goes on to criticize the scribes in maybe some of the least flattering language you will read in the New Testament. They love to walk around with long robes. They love greetings and best seats. They like to devour widows' houses. Ouch. And for pretense, they make long prayers. And then our final section, which I think is in contrast to this, Luke 21, 1 through 4. Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering boxes. And he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more in than all of them. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all she had to live on. He's contrasting this very scribes that are going to help put him to death with this woman that drops 2 copper coins that was worth way more to her than whatever they put in that box. He's contrasting these 2 parties. One party that's doing everything for show and for praise and for adoration and for pretense and for all these things, and one that's doing it because she's generous and she's authentic and she's humble.
Brad, can you imagine what it might be going through the mind of Judas as he hears stories like this?
Okay. On Sunday, Josh will be teaching. Chapter 21, verses 5 through 38 is going to be our text for Sunday. 21:5 through 21:38, we said at the beginning of class. So anyway, I think this thread, we started on Sunday. Jesus coming into the city, pointing to the fact that this temple is not going to stand. This city is not going to make it. And it's for the treatment that they did to the prophets and to the Son of God. And then here in this class, we see how he's establishing his authority. His authority is being greater than David. His authority over the temple and over everything here on earth. So thank you for your comments. And we will continue Sunday.